Tonight, we begin a gentle journey through the heartwarming tale of Big Fish. It's a story about fathers and sons, about the stories we tell and the truths we carry. Let your mind drift as we explore the magical world of Edward Bloom, a man whose life was filled with extraordinary adventures, or perhaps extraordinary imagination. But before that, my name's Murphy, and I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you. If this brings you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Our story opens on a warm evening, filled with celebration and laughter. It's a wedding day, and the air is thick with the scent of flowers and the soft murmur of happy voices. The setting is peaceful and joyful, with white tablecloths fluttering gently in the evening breeze, and string lights casting a golden glow over the gathering. At the center of attention sits Edward Bloom, a man in his later years whose eyes still sparkle with the mischief of a storyteller. Edward has silver hair that catches the light, and when he speaks, people naturally lean in to listen. He has that rare quality that draws others to him, a warmth that makes strangers feel like old friends. Tonight is his son Will's wedding, and Edward is doing what he does best, telling a story. But this isn't just any story. It's the story he's told countless times before, the one about the day Will was born and the fish that got away. Edward's voice is smooth and practiced as he begins the familiar tale. He speaks of a river that ran clear and cool through Alabama countryside, where the water moved slowly over smooth stones and created gentle ripples in the afternoon sun. On this particular day, he tells the gathering, he was fishing in his favorite spot when something extraordinary happened. The fish he caught, according to Edward, was enormous, bigger than any fish that had ever been pulled from those waters. It was silver and powerful, with eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence. Edward describes the struggle, the way the fish fought with such determination that it seemed to understand what was at stake. But here's where the story takes its magical turn. As Edward fought with this incredible fish, he says he realized something important was happening. His wife Sandra was in labor at the hospital, about to give birth to their son. Edward understood, in that moment by the water, that this fish was connected to Will's arrival in the world. So Edward made a choice that would become legendary in his own mind. He released the fish back into the river, making a gentle pact with nature. The fish would remain free, and Edward would have his son. It was a trade, he explains to the wedding guests, between one remarkable creature and another. The wedding guests listen with polite smiles and gentle laughter. Some have heard this story before. Others are experiencing Edward's particular brand of storytelling for the first time. They nod and raise their glasses, enjoying the warmth of the moment and the way Edward's eyes light up as he speaks. But not everyone at the table is charmed by the familiar tale. Will Bloom sits at the head table, watching his father with a mixture of love and frustration that only a son can feel. Will is now a grown man, practical and grounded in ways that his father never was. He has dark hair and serious eyes, and he carries himself with the careful precision of someone who prefers facts to fantasy. Will has heard this fish story hundreds of times throughout his life. Every birthday, every family gathering, every moment when Edward wants to explain something about Will's character or destiny, the fish story emerges. To Will, it's become less of a charming family legend and more of an obstacle between them. As Edward finishes his tale to appreciative murmurs from the wedding guests, Will forces a smile but says nothing. His new wife, Josephine, notices the tension and gently places her hand on Will's arm. She's a kind woman with understanding eyes, someone who can sense the complex currents that flow between fathers and sons. Later, as the evening winds down and guests begin to say their goodbyes, Will finds himself standing apart from the celebration. He watches his father move through the crowd, shaking hands and sharing quiet moments with relatives and friends. Edward has a gift for making people feel special, for finding just the right words to make them smile. But Will sees something different. He sees a man who has spent so many years crafting elaborate stories that the truth has become impossible to separate from the fantasy. Will loves his father, but he's tired of living in a world where every conversation becomes a tall tale, and every memory gets transformed into something grander than it actually was. The frustration has been building for years. As a child, Will was enchanted by his father's stories. Edward would sit at the edge of Will's bed, spinning tales of giants and witches, of magical towns and impossible adventures. Will would fall asleep to these stories, his young mind filled with wonder at the extraordinary life his father claimed to have lived. But as Will grew older, he began to ask questions. He wanted to know which parts were true and which parts were embellished. He wanted to understand his father as a real person, not just as a character in an endless series of adventures. Edward, however, seemed incapable of separating the man from the myth. Now, on Will's wedding day, this pattern continues. Instead of offering a heartfelt speech about his son, or sharing genuine memories from Will's childhood, Edward tells the same old fish story. To Will, it feels like his father is more interested in entertaining strangers than in connecting with his own son. The wedding celebration continues around them, but Will feels a familiar distance opening between himself and his father. It's not anger, exactly, but something quieter and more persistent. It's the sadness of a son who wants to know his father, but feels blocked by an endless wall of stories. 3 years pass quietly after the wedding. Will and Josephine settle into their married life in Paris, where Will works as a journalist. They create a peaceful routine together, exploring the quiet cafes and tree-lined streets of the city. Will finds comfort in the straightforward nature of his work, reporting facts and uncovering truths without embellishment. During this time, Will and his father exchange letters and occasional phone calls, but the conversations remain surface level. Edward continues to tell his stories, and Will continues to listen with polite detachment. The distance between them, both geographical and emotional, seems to grow with each passing month. Then comes the phone call that changes everything. It's a Tuesday morning in early spring when Josephine answers the telephone in their small Paris apartment. Will is at his desk, working on an article about local politics, when he notices the change in his wife's voice. She becomes very still, very careful with her words. When she hangs up the phone, Josephine turns to Will with gentle concern in her eyes. The call was from Sandra, Will's mother. Edward has been diagnosed with cancer, and the prognosis is not encouraging. The doctors are saying he has perhaps a few months, maybe less. The news settles over Will like a heavy blanket. Despite his frustrations with his father, the thought of losing him creates a hollow feeling in his chest. Will realizes that all the conversations he's been avoiding, all the truths he's been wanting to uncover, may soon become impossible to pursue. Josephine helps Will pack his bags with quiet efficiency. She understands, without needing to be told, that this journey home is about more than just saying goodbye. It's about Will's last chance to bridge the gap that has grown between himself and his father. The flight back to Alabama feels long and contemplative. Will stares out the airplane window at the clouds below, thinking about all the stories his father has told over the years. For the first time in a long while, he wonders if maybe he should have listened more carefully, not to judge them or fact-check them, but simply to understand what they meant to the man who told them. When Will arrives in Alabama, the familiar landscape greets him with its rolling hills and warm air. The trees are beginning to show their spring colors, and there's a softness to the light that reminds him of childhood afternoons spent in his parents' backyard. Josephine has never met Edward Bloom in person before the wedding, and that brief encounter was dominated by public celebration rather than private conversation. Now, as they drive from the airport to Will's childhood home, she's both curious and slightly nervous about spending extended time with the famous storyteller she's heard so much about. The house where Will grew up sits on a quiet street lined with oak trees. It's a comfortable, modest home with a front porch that wraps around one side and windows that catch the afternoon light. Sandra has maintained the garden with loving care, and flowers bloom in careful arrangements along the walkway. When they arrive, Sandra greets them at the front door with the kind of warm embrace that only mothers can provide. She's a woman who has aged gracefully, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that hold both strength and sadness. Sandra has spent decades married to Edward Bloom, which means she's learned to navigate the space between his stories and reality with patience and understanding. Edward is resting in the living room when they enter, and Josephine gets her first real look at Will's father outside of a celebratory setting. The cancer has taken some of his vitality, but his eyes still hold that familiar sparkle. He's wearing a comfortable cardigan and sitting in a chair by the window, where he can watch the birds in Sandra's garden. When Edward sees Josephine, his face lights up with genuine pleasure. He rises carefully from his chair and takes her hands in his, welcoming her with the kind of warmth that makes strangers feel like family. Josephine immediately understands why people are drawn to Edward Bloom. There's something magnetic about his presence, even diminished by illness. Over the next few days, Josephine observes the family dynamics with the careful attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand. She watches Will struggle to connect with his father, sees how Edward seems to deflect serious conversations by launching into familiar stories, and notices how Sandra moves through it all with the practiced grace of someone who has learned to love both men, despite their differences. During quiet moments in the kitchen, Sandra shares small insights with Josephine about the family history. She speaks fondly of Edward's storytelling gifts, while also acknowledging the challenges they've created. Sandra has her own perspective on which stories might contain kernels of truth, and which ones are purely products of Edward's imagination, but she's learned to appreciate them all as expressions of how Edward sees the world. Josephine finds herself charmed by Edward's stories, perhaps because she doesn't carry Will's burden of a lifetime spent trying to separate fact from fiction. When Edward tells her about the time he caught fish with his bare hands, or describes meeting a giant who became his traveling companion, Josephine listens with the kind of openness that Will lost somewhere in his journey to adulthood. But she also sees Will's frustration clearly. She watches her husband sit through another retelling of the fish story, observing how his jaw tightens and his hands clench slightly. Josephine begins to understand that this isn't really about the stories themselves. It's about a son who desperately wants to know his father as a real person, not just as a collection of magical adventures. As the days pass in his childhood home, Will finds himself caught between two competing desires. Part of him wants to simply accept his father's condition and spend their remaining time together in peace and comfort. But a stronger part of him feels that this may be his last chance to break through the wall of stories and discover who Edward Bloom really is, underneath all the tall tales. Will begins to approach his father more directly, asking specific questions about the stories he's heard throughout his life. He wants to know about Edward's actual childhood, his real experiences during the war, the true story of how he met Sandra. But Edward seems genuinely puzzled by these requests for literal truth, as if he doesn't understand why the facts matter more than the feelings the stories create. When Will asks about the giant fish from his birth story, Edward launches into an even more elaborate version of the tale, adding details about the weather that day and the specific type of bait he used. When Will presses for concrete evidence or asks Sandra to confirm the details, Edward looks hurt and confused, as if his son is missing the entire point. The conversations become a gentle dance of approach and avoidance. Will pushes for truth, and Edward responds with stories. Edward offers magical adventures, and Will asks for mundane facts. Neither man seems able to communicate in the language the other needs to hear. During one afternoon conversation on the front porch, Will tries a different approach. Instead of challenging the stories directly, he asks his father to help him understand why these particular adventures were important enough to remember and retell. What did the giant fish represent to Edward? Why does the story about meeting a giant matter so much? Edward considers these questions thoughtfully, rocking slowly in his porch chair as the afternoon light filters through the oak leaves. For a moment, Will hopes they might be approaching some kind of breakthrough. But then Edward begins another story, this one about a town where time moved differently and people never aged, and Will realizes they're back in familiar territory. The frustration builds slowly, like pressure in a steam kettle. Will loves his father and wants to honor his remaining time, but he also feels a growing urgency to connect with Edward in some meaningful way before it's too late. The stories that once enchanted him as a child now feel like barriers preventing real intimacy between them. Josephine watches these interactions with growing understanding. She begins to see that both men are trying to love each other in the only ways they know how. Edward expresses love through stories, creating magical worlds where ordinary life becomes extraordinary. Will expresses love by seeking truth, wanting to know and appreciate his father's actual experiences and achievements. But neither man seems able to bridge the gap between story and truth, between the magical and the mundane. As Edward's condition gradually worsens, Will realizes that time is running out for the kind of honest conversation he's been seeking his entire adult life. The tension isn't angry or bitter. It's sadder than that. The quiet sadness of two people who love each other, but can't quite find a way to communicate across the different languages they speak. Edward speaks in metaphor and magic, while Will speaks in facts and evidence. Both languages are expressions of love, but they don't seem to translate easily from one to the other. As Will continues to struggle with understanding his father, Edward begins to share stories from his youth with more detail than ever before. perhaps sensing his son's need for connection, or perhaps simply feeling the pull of memory as his health declines, Edward starts at the very beginning, with a story about a witch who lived in the woods outside his childhood town. Edward's voice takes on a dreamy quality as he describes the small Alabama town where he grew up. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where children played freely in the streets until the streetlights came on, and where mysterious stories spread like morning mist through the community. The most persistent story in young Edward's town was about the old woman who lived alone in a decrepit house deep in the woods. Children whispered that she was a witch, someone who could see things that hadn't happened yet, and knew secrets about everyone in town. The house itself was said to be covered in hanging bottles and strange charms, with a garden full of herbs that grew in impossible colors. Most children were content to tell scary stories about the witch from a safe distance, but Edward was different even as a boy. He was curious about everything, especially things that other people feared. When he was around 10 years old, he made a decision that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. He decided to visit the witch himself. Edward describes the walk through the woods as both terrifying and peaceful. The trees created a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor, and the air smelled of moss and old leaves. Every step seemed to echo in the quiet, and Edward had to force himself to keep moving forward instead of running back to the safety of town. When he finally reached the witch's house, it was exactly as the stories described, ramshackle and covered with hanging glass bottles that caught what little light filtered through the trees. The bottles clinked gently in the breeze, creating a soft, musical sound that was both beautiful and unsettling. The witch herself was not what Edward expected. She was old, certainly, with wild grey hair and clothes that seemed to be made from patches of different fabrics. But her eyes were sharp and kind, and when she saw the young boy standing at the edge of her garden, she simply nodded as if she had been expecting him. Edward tells Will and Josephine that the witch invited him inside for tea, as naturally as if he were a neighbor stopping by for a visit. Her house was filled with curious objects, jars of dried flowers, books written in languages Edward didn't recognize, and mirrors of all different shapes and sizes hanging on every wall. But the most remarkable thing about the witch was her glass eye. Where her left eye should have been, she had a perfect sphere of clear glass that seemed to swirl with its own internal light. Edward found himself unable to look away from it, fascinated by the way it caught and reflected the afternoon sun. The witch noticed Edward's fascination and made him an offer that would shape his understanding of life and death forever. She told him that her glass eye could show people exactly how they would die, not when, but how. She offered to show Edward his own death if he was brave enough to look. Most children would have run away at this point, but Edward's curiosity was stronger than his fear. He agreed to look into the glass eye, and what he saw there changed everything about how he understood his own life. In the swirling depths of the witch's glass eye, Edward saw himself as an old man, lying peacefully in a hospital bed, surrounded by people he loved. There was no violence, no accident, no sudden tragedy, just a gentle passing at the end of a long, full life, with family nearby and stories still being told. This vision gave Edward a sense of invincibility that would follow him through all his subsequent adventures, because he knew how his story would end, quietly, peacefully, surrounded by love. He felt free to take risks and pursue experiences that other people might avoid. The witch's glass eye became his protection against fear and his encouragement to live boldly. When Edward finishes this story, Will finds himself strangely moved despite his usual skepticism. There's something about the way his father describes that childhood encounter that feels different from his other tales. The details are vivid, but not exaggerated, and the emotional truth of a young boy facing his mortality resonates in a way that the more fantastical stories don't always manage. Edward continues his childhood memories by describing the town of Ashton, where he spent his early years. Ashton was the kind of small southern town that existed in dozens of places across Alabama in the 1930s and 40s, a place where life moved slowly, and everyone had a role to play in the community's daily rhythm. The town centered around a main street lined with practical businesses, a general store, a barber shop, a small bank, and a diner where the coffee was always fresh and the pie was made daily. The buildings were modest but well maintained, painted in soft colors that complemented the warm Alabama sun. Edward describes growing up in this environment with genuine fondness. His own family lived in a simple house with a front porch where they spent summer evenings watching the world go by. His father worked at the local mill, coming home each day covered in flour dust that his mother would brush off his shoulders with patient affection. In Ashton, Edward was known as the boy who was always asking questions and always looking for adventure. While other children were content to play the same games in the same places day after day, Edward was constantly exploring new corners of the town and surrounding countryside. He knew where the best fishing holes were located, which trees had the strongest branches for climbing, and which neighbors told the most interesting stories. School in Ashton was held in a single building that housed all grades together, with windows that opened wide during the warm months, and a pot-bellied stove that kept everyone warm during the brief Alabama winters. Edward was a good student, but his teachers often noted that his mind seemed to wander beyond the confines of textbooks and lesson plans. The town had its own rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Spring brought wildflowers that bloomed along the roadside, and the excitement of planning for summer adventures. Summer meant long, lazy days, swimming in the local creek, and catching fireflies in mason jars as evening settled over the town. Fall brought harvest festivals and the smell of leaves burning in backyard piles. Winter was mild but cozy, with families gathering around radios in the evening to listen to programs that transported them to distant places. Edward's childhood in Ashton was peaceful and secure, but even as a young boy, he felt the pull of something larger beyond the town limits. He would stand at the edge of Ashton and look down the road that led to other places, wondering what adventures waited in the wider world. This restlessness wasn't discontent with his home. He loved Ashton and the people in it, but rather a recognition that his story was meant to unfold across a larger canvas. The townspeople of Ashton were the kind of neighbors who looked after each other's children, shared vegetables from their gardens, and gathered on front porches in the evening to swap stories and local news. They were practical, hard-working people who found joy in simple pleasures and comfort in familiar routines. But even in this peaceful setting, Edward was already showing signs of the storyteller he would become. When children gathered to play, Edward often invented elaborate games with complex backstories. When adults asked him about his day at school, his answers included details that might have been embellished, but were always more interesting than simple facts might have been. As Edward grew into his teenage years, Ashton began to face challenges that tested the community's resilience and unity. The most significant of these was a series of floods that plagued the town for several consecutive years, turning the usually peaceful creek into a destructive force that damaged homes and businesses. Edward describes these floods with the kind of detail that suggests he witnessed them firsthand. The water would rise slowly at first, seeping into the lower areas of town and creating muddy pools in places that were usually dry. But then, with surprising speed, the creek would overflow its banks completely, sending muddy water rushing through the main street and into people's homes. The flooding brought more than just water damage. It created an atmosphere of uncertainty and worry that was unfamiliar to the usually optimistic townspeople of Ashton. Families who had never known financial hardship found themselves dealing with ruined furniture, damaged crops, and the constant anxiety of wondering when the next flood might come. Local businesses struggled to recover from the repeated water damage. The general store lost inventory to flood waters several times, and the diner had to close for weeks at a time while the owners cleaned mud from every surface and replaced equipment that had been ruined by the rising water. The floods also revealed some of the deeper currents of tension that existed beneath Ashton's peaceful surface. When resources became scarce and people were under stress, old disagreements surfaced, and new conflicts emerged. Neighbors who had been friendly for years found themselves arguing over flood cleanup responsibilities and recovery priorities. Edward watched all of this unfold during his formative teenage years, and the experience taught him important lessons about community resilience and individual responsibility. He saw how some people responded to crisis by becoming more generous and helpful, while others became defensive and self-protective. He learned that even the most peaceful places could face serious challenges, and that how people responded to those challenges revealed their true character. The flooding problem seemed intractable to most of the adults in Ashton. They tried various solutions, building small levees, diverting parts of the creek, even consulting with engineers from larger towns, but nothing seemed to provide a permanent solution. The floods continued to come, year after year, and the town began to develop a resigned acceptance that this was simply part of life in Ashton. But Edward refused to accept this resignation. Even as a teenager, he believed that every problem had a solution, even if that solution wasn't immediately obvious. He spent hours by the creek, studying its patterns and trying to understand why it flooded so consistently. He talked to older residents about how the waterways had changed over the years, and he read everything he could find about flood control and water management. This period of Edward's life established patterns that would follow him into adulthood, his refusal to accept limitations. The solution to Ashton's flooding problem came, according to Edward, in the most unexpected way possible, through his encounter with the legendary fish that had been living in the creek for decades. Edward explains that local fishermen had been telling stories about this particular fish for as long as anyone could remember. It was said to be enormous, much larger than any fish that should reasonably live in such a small waterway. More importantly, it was supposedly impossible to catch, having outsmarted every angler who had ever tried to land it. Most people treated the giant fish as a local legend, something fun to talk about, but not necessarily real. But Edward had heard enough consistent details from different sources that he began to suspect the fish might actually exist. And if it existed, he reasoned, there might be a connection between its presence and the flooding problems that plagued the town. Edward's theory was that the fish had grown so large that it was actually disrupting the natural flow of the creek. When it moved through certain narrow passages, it might be creating temporary dams that caused water to back up and eventually overflow the banks. If he could somehow remove the fish from the creek, the flooding might stop. This theory seemed far-fetched to most adults, but Edward was determined to test it. He spent weeks preparing for his fishing expedition, researching the strongest lines and the most effective bait. He talked to every fisherman in town about their experiences with the legendary fish, gathering details about its habits and preferences. The fishing attempt itself became a town-wide event. Word spread that young Edward Bloom was planning to catch the uncatchable fish, and people gathered along the creek banks to watch his effort. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others because they wanted to support Edward's initiative, and still others because they enjoyed the entertainment of watching someone attempt the impossible. Edward set up his fishing equipment at dawn, when the creek was still and quiet, and the morning light created perfect conditions for seeing into the water. He used special bait that he had prepared according to advice from the most experienced local fishermen, and he positioned himself at the spot where the fish had most often been sighted over the years. The wait was long and patient. Edward sat by the water for hours, maintaining his focus and refusing to give up even when some of the spectators began to drift away. He understood that catching this fish, if it could be caught at all, would require persistence and faith in addition to skill and preparation. Then, just as the afternoon sun was beginning to create long shadows across the creek, something extraordinary happened. Edward's line suddenly went taut, and the force on the other end was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The fish was not only real, but even larger and more powerful than the stories had suggested. The struggle that followed became legendary in Ashton's local history. Edward found himself engaged in a battle of wills with a creature that seemed to embody the wild, untamed spirit of the natural world. The fish fought with intelligence and determination, using every trick it had learned over its many years of avoiding capture. But Edward had advantages that previous fishermen had lacked: complete confidence in his eventual success, infinite patience, and the encouragement of an entire community that had gathered to witness his attempt. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Edward finally managed to bring the enormous fish to shore. The fish was indeed spectacular, silver-scaled, powerful, and so large that it took several people to help Edward carry it away from the water. But more importantly, Edward's theory proved correct. Once the fish was removed from the creek, the flooding problems that had plagued Ashton for years mysteriously disappeared. The water flowed smoothly through its banks, and the town never experienced another destructive flood. Edward had become a local hero, not just for catching an impossible fish, but for solving a community problem that had seemed beyond solution. The experience reinforced his belief that individual initiative could overcome collective challenges, and it established his reputation as someone who could accomplish extraordinary things through a combination of determination and creative thinking. The success of catching the giant fish and solving Ashton's flooding problem might have been enough adventure for most young men, but for Edward, it only confirmed that he was meant for experiences beyond the boundaries of his small hometown. As he reached young adulthood, his sense of restlessness grew stronger, fueled by the confidence he had gained from his early adventures. Edward describes the decision to leave Ashton as both inevitable and difficult. He loved his family, his community, and the familiar rhythms of small-town life, but he also felt called to discover what other extraordinary experiences might be waiting for him in the wider world. The witch's glass eye had shown him that he would live a long, full life, and Edward interpreted this as permission to seek out adventures that might seem risky to others. His parents understood their son's need to explore beyond Ashton, even though saying goodbye was painful for everyone involved. They had raised Edward to be independent and curious, and they recognized that those same qualities that made him special also made it impossible for him to settle into a conventional small-town life without first seeing what else the world had to offer. Edward's departure from Ashton was marked by the kind of community celebration that small towns do best. Neighbors gathered to wish him well, offering advice, small gifts, and promises to remember him fondly while he was away. The local diner prepared a special meal in his honor, and the general store owner gave him supplies for his journey. But the most meaningful farewell came from the creek, where Edward had caught the giant fish. He spent his final evening in Ashton, sitting by the water, reflecting on the adventures that had shaped his childhood and trying to imagine what lay ahead. The creek flowed peacefully past him, no longer the source of flooding and anxiety it had once been, but simply a gentle waterway that would always remind him of home. As Edward prepared to leave the next morning, he carried with him more than just his few possessions and his family's blessings. He carried the confidence that came from knowing he could solve problems and overcome challenges. He carried the storytelling traditions he had learned from listening to older residents share their experiences. And he carried the unshakable belief that his life was meant to be filled with extraordinary adventures. The road that led out of Ashton stretched toward horizons that promised new experiences and unknown possibilities. Edward walked down that road with the kind of hopeful anticipation that only comes from being young, confident, and completely open to whatever adventures might be waiting ahead. Edward's first adventure beyond the familiar boundaries of Ashton came sooner than he expected, and in a form that would have frightened most travelers, but merely intrigued the young man who had already learned to see wonder instead of danger in unusual situations. Edward had been walking along the dusty road that connected Ashton to the wider world for most of the morning, enjoying the feeling of complete freedom and the anticipation of unknown adventures ahead. The Alabama countryside stretched in all directions around him, with rolling hills covered in pine trees and occasional farmhouses sitting peacefully in the distance. As the afternoon heat began to build, Edward decided to rest in the shade of a large oak tree that stood beside the road. He was eating lunch and enjoying the quiet when he heard sounds coming from deeper in the woods, the kind of heavy crashing that suggested something very large was moving through the trees. Most travelers would have quickly gathered their belongings and continued down the road. But Edward's curiosity was stronger than his caution. He left his pack by the tree and walked into the woods to investigate the source of the noise, following a path of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth. What he discovered in a small clearing was a man unlike anyone he had ever seen before. The stranger was enormous. Not just tall, but proportioned like a regular person who had been scaled up to impossible dimensions. He had to be at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed as wide as doorways, and hands that could easily palm basketballs. But despite his intimidating size, there was something gentle and sad about the giant. He was sitting alone in the clearing, surrounded by the remains of several trees that he had apparently uprooted in frustration. His clothes were simple and worn, and his expression was one of complete dejection. Edward approached the giant with the same fearless curiosity he had shown when visiting the witch as a child. Instead of being frightened by the stranger's size, he was fascinated by the story that size might represent. He introduced himself politely and asked if he could be of any help. The giant looked up with surprise and gratitude that someone would approach him with kindness rather than fear. He introduced himself as Carl, and in a voice that was deep but surprisingly gentle, he explained his situation. Carl had been living alone in the woods for years, avoiding towns and people because his size made him an object of fear and curiosity wherever he went. Carl told Edward that he was desperately lonely, but didn't know how to connect with other people. Every time he tried to visit a town or make friends, people either ran away in terror or treated him like a freak show attraction. He had given up trying to live among normal-sized people and had resigned himself to a solitary existence in the wilderness. Edward listened to Carl's story with the kind of genuine empathy that immediately establishes trust between strangers. He understood what it felt like to be different from other people, though his difference made him magnetic rather than frightening. More importantly, Edward had a gift for seeing past surface appearances to the person underneath. As they talked, Edward learned that Carl was not only gentle and intelligent, but also incredibly skilled at practical tasks. His size made him capable of accomplishing physical work that would be impossible for ordinary people. But he had no outlet for using these abilities constructively. He was like a powerful tool sitting unused because no one knew how to appreciate its potential. Edward made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of continuing his journey alone, he invited Carl to travel with him as a companion and partner. Edward believed that two people with unusual qualities could accomplish more together than either could achieve separately, and he was excited by the possibility of having a friend who shared his appetite for adventure. Carl was initially hesitant to accept Edward's invitation. He had learned to expect rejection and disappointment from other people, and he was afraid that Edward would eventually come to see him as a burden rather than a blessing. But Edward's enthusiasm was genuine and persistent, and Carl finally agreed to give the partnership a chance. The friendship between Edward and Carl developed naturally as they walked the back roads of Alabama together, sharing stories and discovering how well their different strengths complemented each other. Edward provided social skills, optimism, and creative problem-solving, while Carl contributed practical abilities, gentle wisdom, and a protective presence that made traveling safer and easier. After several days of wandering through the countryside, they came to a fork in the road that would lead them toward one of the most magical experiences of Edward's young life. One path was clearly marked and well-traveled, leading toward a decent-sized town where they could find food, lodging, and supplies. The other path was barely visible, disappearing into a dense forest that seemed older and quieter than the surrounding countryside. Most travelers would have chosen the obvious, practical route, but Edward was drawn to mysteries and hidden possibilities. With Carl's agreement, they decided to explore the unmarked path, following it as it wound deeper into the forest and away from any signs of conventional civilization. The walk through the forest felt like entering a different world entirely. The trees grew taller and closer together, creating a canopy so thick that the afternoon sun created only scattered patches of light on the forest floor. The air smelled of moss and wildflowers, and the only sounds were their own footsteps and the gentle whisper of wind through the leaves. After walking for what felt like hours, they emerged from the forest into the most beautiful place either of them had ever seen. Before them lay a town that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space, a place where every detail was perfect and peaceful in ways that defied ordinary experience. The town was called Spectre, and it was unlike anywhere else Edward had ever imagined. The houses were painted in soft, welcoming colors, and surrounded by gardens that bloomed with flowers of every imaginable variety. The streets were paved with smooth stones that seemed to glow with their own internal light, and small streams ran alongside the walkways, creating the gentle sound of moving water throughout the town. The people of Spectre were as remarkable as their surroundings. Everyone they met was friendly, peaceful, and genuinely happy in ways that suggested they had never experienced conflict, worry, or dissatisfaction. Children played freely in the streets. Adults worked at crafts and trades that brought them joy rather than mere survival. And elderly residents sat peacefully in the shade, sharing stories and wisdom with anyone who cared to listen. What made Spectre most magical was the sense that time moved differently there than in the outside world. Days seemed to stretch longer, allowing for rest and contemplation that felt impossible in ordinary places. Conversations unfolded slowly and naturally, without the rush and urgency that characterized life in normal towns. Even simple activities like eating or walking became more pleasurable and meaningful in Spectre's peaceful atmosphere. Edward and Carl were welcomed into the community with warmth and generosity that surpassed even southern hospitality. The residents of Spectre seemed genuinely delighted to have visitors, and they shared their homes, their food, and their stories without expecting anything in return. For the first time in his life, Carl experienced complete acceptance from a community of people who saw his size as interesting rather than frightening. The town had everything needed for a comfortable, satisfying life. Skilled craftspeople who created beautiful and useful objects, farmers who grew abundant crops in soil that seemed unusually fertile, and artists who filled the community with music, poetry, and visual beauty that enriched everyone's daily experience. Edward found himself torn between conflicting emotions as he experienced life in Spectre. Part of him was enchanted by the peace and beauty of the place, and he could easily imagine spending years there, learning the town's crafts and traditions while contributing his own energy and enthusiasm to the community. But another part of him recognized that Spectre's perfection might also be a kind of trap, a place so comfortable and satisfying that leaving would become impossible. As Edward and Carl spent more time in Spectre, they began to understand the deeper nature of the magical town and the price that its perfection demanded from those who chose to make it their permanent home. The residents were indeed happy and peaceful, but their contentment came from accepting limits that Edward found increasingly uncomfortable. Life in Spectre moved according to gentle, predictable rhythms that never varied from season to season or year to year. People woke at the same time each day, pursued the same pleasant activities, and went to sleep each evening with the satisfaction of another peaceful day completed. There was no conflict, but there was also no growth, no challenge, and no sense that tomorrow might bring experiences different from today. Edward realized that the residents of Spectre had traded adventure and possibility for security and peace. They had chosen comfort over growth, predictability over surprise, and safety over the risks that made life exciting and meaningful. For people who valued stability above all else, Spectre was paradise. But for someone like Edward, whose spirit thrived on challenge and change, it began to feel like a beautiful prison. The town's leaders seemed to understand Edward's nature better than he understood it himself. During his stay, several of the elders approached him for quiet conversations about his plans and intentions. They were kind and wise, but they also made it clear that Spectre was not meant for everyone, especially not for young people whose stories were still being written. One elderly woman, who seemed to serve as an unofficial spokesperson for the community, explained to Edward that Spectre existed as a refuge for people who had completed their adventures and were ready to settle into peaceful contentment. It was a place for endings, not beginnings, a destination for those who had explored the world and were ready to rest from their travels. She told Edward that young people occasionally discovered Spectre, and they were always welcomed warmly during brief visits. But those whose spirits were still restless and whose stories were still unfolding could never remain permanently in the town, because Spectre's magic depended on acceptance and satisfaction that Edward was not yet ready to embrace. Carl, surprisingly, found himself more suited to Spectre's peaceful rhythms than his traveling companion. The giant's years of loneliness and rejection had created a deep appreciation for the simple pleasure of being accepted and valued by a community. He was tempted to remain in Spectre permanently, finally finding the home he had been seeking throughout his solitary years. But Carl also understood that his friendship with Edward was one of the most important relationships of his life, and he was not willing to sacrifice that bond for even the perfect peace that Spectre offered. When Edward began to express restlessness about continuing their journey, Carl agreed to leave the magical town, though not without some sadness about abandoning the first place where he had ever felt completely at home. The decision to leave Spectre was made easier by the town's residents, who seemed to understand that departure was inevitable for visitors like Edward and Carl. Instead of trying to convince them to stay or expressing disappointment about their choice, the townspeople helped them prepare for the next stage of their journey with the same generosity they had shown upon their arrival. The farewell from Spectre was bittersweet, but ultimately liberating. Edward and Carl left the town with renewed appreciation for adventure and uncertainty, carrying with them memories of perfect peace that would sustain them during more difficult times ahead. They had learned that happiness could take many forms, but for people like themselves, true satisfaction came from embracing challenge rather than avoiding it. After leaving the peaceful perfection of Spectre, Edward and Carl found themselves back on the dusty roads of Alabama, looking for new adventures and opportunities to use their unique talents productively. They had been traveling for several days when they encountered something that would provide Edward with one of the most important experiences of his young life. The first sign of the circus was the music, lively, cheerful melodies that drifted across the countryside and suggested celebration and excitement ahead. As they followed the sound, they began to see colorful posters attached to fence posts and trees, advertising the arrival of Calloway's Circus, featuring amazing acts and incredible performers from around the world. When they finally reached the circus grounds, Edward and Carl found themselves in the middle of controlled chaos that was both overwhelming and exhilarating. Workers were setting up enormous tents, performers were practicing their routines, and animals were being cared for by handlers who treated them with obvious affection and expertise. The circus was a world unto itself, complete with its own customs, hierarchies, and ways of solving problems. It attracted people who didn't quite fit into conventional society. Individuals with unusual talents, appearances, or perspectives who had found a place where their differences were valued rather than merely tolerated. Edward was immediately fascinated by the circus environment and eager to become part of it, but he soon learned that joining was not simply a matter of expressing interest. The circus was run by Amos Calloway, a man with exacting standards who carefully evaluated potential performers and workers before allowing them to become part of his traveling family. Amos Calloway was a showman in the best sense of the word. Someone who understood that entertaining people required not just talent, but also dedication, reliability, and genuine care for the audience's experience. He was probably in his 50s, with silver-grey hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through any pretense or false promises. When Edward and Carl approached Amos about joining the circus, he was initially skeptical about what they might contribute. Carl's size was certainly impressive, but Amos had worked with other large performers before, and he knew that spectacle alone wasn't enough to create a truly memorable act. Edward's enthusiasm was obvious, but Amos needed to see evidence of actual skills and commitment. Amos set up a series of tests and challenges for both men, designed to evaluate not just their abilities, but their character and determination. Carl was asked to demonstrate his strength in various practical ways, showing that he could not only lift heavy objects, but also work safely and precisely with the equipment and animals that were essential to circus operations. Edward's evaluation was more complex because his talents were less obvious and more difficult to categorize. Amos tested his ability to connect with audiences, his willingness to learn new skills, and his capacity for the kind of creative problem-solving that circus life demanded on a daily basis. Edward passed these tests, not through superior ability, but through enthusiasm, persistence, and genuine curiosity about every aspect of circus life. After several days of evaluation, Amos decided to offer both men positions with the traveling show. Carl would work as a strongman and general laborer, contributing his physical capabilities to the practical side of circus operations. Edward would start as a general helper and apprentice, learning various skills while proving that he could handle the responsibilities that came with circus membership. Joining Calloway's circus meant becoming part of a close-knit community that traveled constantly, lived in close quarters, and depended on each member to contribute their best effort every single day. It was demanding work that required physical stamina, emotional resilience, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. But for Edward, the circus represented everything he had been seeking since leaving Ashton. Adventure, variety, the chance to develop new skills, and the opportunity to be part of something larger and more exciting than ordinary life. The circus was a place where being unusual was an advantage rather than a limitation, and where every day brought new experiences and opportunities for growth. Edward's life in the circus quickly settled into rhythms that combined hard work with constant excitement and learning. He threw himself into every aspect of circus life, from caring for the animals to setting up equipment to learning the basics of various performance arts. His enthusiasm and natural charm made him popular with both performers and audiences, and Amos Calloway began to trust him with increasingly important responsibilities. But everything changed for Edward on the evening when he first saw Sandra Templeton, the woman who would become the center of his world and the inspiration for countless future adventures. The circus was performing in a small town outside of Birmingham, and Edward was working behind the scenes to ensure that everything ran smoothly during the show. It was his job to watch the audience during performances, identifying potential problems and making sure that spectators were enjoying the experience safely and comfortably. As he scanned the crowd during the evening performance, Edward's attention was suddenly captured by a young woman sitting in the third row. She had golden hair that caught the light from the circus lanterns, and when she laughed at the clown's antics, her face lit up in a way that made everything else fade into the background. Edward found himself unable to look away from Sandra, completely mesmerized by her presence and the joy she took in the circus performance. She watched each act with genuine delight and appreciation, clapping enthusiastically for the performers and leaning forward in her seat during the more exciting moments. For Edward, seeing Sandra was like experiencing a revelation about what his future was meant to hold. He had always been confident that his life would be filled with adventures and extraordinary experiences, but until this moment, those adventures had been abstract possibilities rather than concrete goals. Now suddenly, he knew that winning Sandra's love would be the most important adventure of his life. The problem was that Sandra was not alone at the circus. She was accompanied by a young man who was clearly her boyfriend or fiancé, someone who held her hand during the more thrilling acts and shared private jokes with her between performances. The young man was handsome, well-dressed, and obviously from a wealthy family. He looked like the kind of person who had never doubted that good things would come to him naturally. Edward learned from other circus members that Sandra was a local girl who was engaged to Don Price, the son of one of the wealthiest families in the area. Don was everything that conventional wisdom would consider an ideal husband, financially secure, socially prominent, and completely devoted to Sandra. From any practical perspective, Sandra's future was settled and secure. But Edward had never been limited by practical perspectives or conventional wisdom. Looking at Sandra in the circus audience, he felt the same certainty he had experienced when deciding to catch the giant fish, or when choosing to explore the hidden path that led to Spectre. He knew, with absolute conviction, that Sandra was meant to be part of his story, regardless of what obstacles might stand in his way. The evening performance ended, and the audience began to file out of the big tent, returning to their regular lives and leaving the circus members to clean up and prepare for the next day's travel. But Edward couldn't let Sandra disappear without at least attempting to meet her, even if the circumstances seemed impossible. He found a way to position himself near the tent's exit, hoping to catch Sandra's attention as she left with her fiancé. When she walked past him, Edward managed to catch her eye for just a moment, and in that brief glance, he tried to communicate everything he was feeling: his instant recognition that she was special, his certainty that they were meant to know each other, and his determination to find a way to make that connection, despite the apparent impossibility of the situation. Sandra paused for just an instant when their eyes met, and Edward saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, curiosity, perhaps even recognition of the same electric connection he was experiencing. But then Don Price guided her away from the tent, and she disappeared into the crowd of departing spectators. Edward stood in the empty tent for a long time after everyone had gone, replaying that brief moment of eye contact and planning how he might learn more about Sandra Templeton and find legitimate reasons to cross paths with her again. The morning after seeing Sandra at the circus, Edward approached Amos Calloway with a request that was both professional and deeply personal. He wanted to know if there were ways for circus members to learn more about the communities they visited, not just for entertainment purposes, but to build relationships that might benefit both the circus and the local people. Amos was an experienced showman who had seen young performers become infatuated with audience members before, and he recognized the signs immediately. But he also respected Edward's work ethic and growing value to the circus, so he was willing to help, within reasonable limits. Amos explained that successful circus operations depended partly on understanding local social dynamics and building relationships with influential community members. In each town they visited, someone needed to handle public relations, coordinate with local officials, and ensure that the circus maintained a positive reputation that would welcome them back in future years. This community liaison work was typically handled by Amos himself, but he was getting older and increasingly interested in delegating such responsibilities to trustworthy performers who showed aptitude for social interaction. Edward's natural charm and genuine interest in people made him a good candidate for this kind of work. Under the guise of community relations, Edward began making inquiries about prominent local families, including the Templetons and the Prices. He learned that Sandra's father owned a successful hardware store and was respected throughout the area for his honesty and fair dealing. The Templetons were comfortable, but not wealthy, hard-working people who had earned their place in the community through dedication and integrity. The Price family, on the other hand, owned significant property and businesses throughout the region. Don Price was their only son and heir to considerable wealth and influence. His engagement to Sandra was seen by many people as an ideal match that would benefit both families and strengthen the community's social structure. But Edward also learned details that revealed cracks in what seemed like a perfect situation. Several people mentioned that while Don was certainly devoted to Sandra, he was also possessive and controlling in ways that sometimes made Sandra uncomfortable. He had strong opinions about how she should dress, which friends she should spend time with, and what activities were appropriate for a woman in her social position. Edward began to understand that Sandra's situation might be more complicated than it appeared on the surface. She was engaged to a man who could provide security and social status, but those advantages might come at the cost of personal freedom and self-determination. This realization made Edward even more determined to find a way to offer Sandra alternatives to the future that had been planned for her. Through careful questioning and patient observation, Edward learned Sandra's routines and habits. He discovered that she taught Sunday school at the local church, volunteered at the community library, and often walked alone through the town's parks and gardens in the early morning hours when the air was still cool and the streets were quiet. These morning walks became Edward's opportunity to encounter Sandra in a natural, unforced way. He began timing his own walks through town to coincide with hers, creating opportunities for casual meetings that might develop into conversations and eventually into the kind of friendship that could grow into something deeper. During his time working closely with Amos Calloway, Edward began to notice unusual patterns in his boss's behavior that seemed to correspond with the phases of the moon. Around the time of each full moon, Amos would become increasingly restless and distracted, delegating more responsibilities to other circus members and disappearing for entire nights without explanation. Most circus performers were accustomed to eccentricity and respected each other's privacy, so Amos's periodic absences didn't create gossip or concern among the troupe. But Edward's natural curiosity and his growing friendship with the circus owner made him more observant of these mysterious disappearances. Edward noticed that Amos's absences always coincided with reports of unusual animal activity in whatever area the circus was visiting. Local farmers would mention livestock acting nervous and skittish. Dogs would bark throughout the night for no apparent reason, and occasionally people would report seeing large, wolf-like creatures moving through the countryside. The pieces of this puzzle came together for Edward, gradually, through careful observation rather than dramatic revelation. He began to understand that Amos Calloway was not entirely human, but rather someone who transformed into something wild and powerful during the full moon each month. This discovery might have frightened or disgusted some people, But Edward's reaction was characteristically practical and accepting. He had already learned that the world contained extraordinary things that couldn't be explained by conventional logic. Witches with glass eyes that showed the future, magical towns that existed outside normal time, and giants who became gentle companions. A circus owner, who was also a werewolf, seemed like simply another example of the wonderful strangeness that made life interesting. Edward's acceptance of Amos's true nature deepened the friendship between them and increased Amos's trust in Edward's judgment and discretion. Amos had spent years carefully hiding his condition from others, living with the constant fear that discovery would destroy both his career and his relationships. Finding someone who could accept him completely, without fear or judgment, was profoundly meaningful for the older man. In return for Edward's understanding and loyalty, Amos began sharing more responsibility and authority within the circus organization. He taught Edward advanced skills in business management, performance coordination, and the subtle arts of reading audiences and adapting shows to different communities' preferences and expectations. But more importantly, Amos became Edward's mentor in matters of the heart. He had observed Edward's growing infatuation with Sandra Templeton, and he understood both the intensity of young love and the practical challenges that Edward would need to overcome to win Sandra's affections. Amos's own experience with transformation and acceptance gave him unique insights into the courage required to pursue seemingly impossible goals. He encouraged Edward's romantic ambitions while also helping him develop realistic strategies for gradually building a relationship with Sandra, despite the obstacles presented by her engagement to Don Price. The werewolf revelation also explained some of Amos's business practices and the circus's unusual success in building loyal audiences wherever they traveled. Amos's supernatural senses allowed him to understand people and communities in ways that purely human showmen couldn't match. He could detect underlying tensions, hidden desires, and unspoken needs that audiences weren't even consciously aware of, then craft performances that addressed those deeper currents. This combination of supernatural insight and genuine care for people's well-being made Calloway's circus something special, not just entertainment, but a source of wonder and healing that left communities feeling enriched and renewed after each visit. As the circus season continued, and Edward's understanding of Sandra's life became more complete, he learned that she was enrolled as a student at Auburn University, studying education with the goal of becoming a teacher. This information provided Edward with the opportunity he had been seeking, a legitimate reason to visit the university town and create opportunities for more substantial interaction with Sandra. Edward approached Amos about the possibility of the circus performing at Auburn, suggesting that college towns provided excellent audiences for their type of entertainment. University students were typically eager for diversion from their studies, and they appreciated the artistry and skill that went into circus performances. Amos agreed that Auburn would be a worthwhile addition to their touring schedule. The circus's arrival at Auburn created exactly the kind of excitement Edward had hoped for. College students flocked to the performances, bringing energy and enthusiasm that made every show feel like a celebration. The campus buzzed with talk about the amazing acts and colorful characters that had temporarily transformed their academic environment into something magical and unexpected. But Edward's real focus was on finding Sandra and creating circumstances that would allow them to spend time together naturally and comfortably. He learned that she lived in a dormitory near the center of campus, and that she followed regular routines that included morning walks across the university's tree-lined quad. Edward began timing his own activities to coincide with Sandra's schedule, creating opportunities for what appeared to be accidental encounters. He would be walking across campus when she emerged from the library, or sitting peacefully under a tree reading when she passed by on her way to classes. These casual meetings gradually developed into brief conversations, then longer discussions about literature, education, and their respective dreams for the future. Edward discovered that Sandra was intelligent, thoughtful, and genuinely passionate about helping children learn and grow. She had a natural warmth that drew people to her, but also a strength of character that suggested she would not be easily influenced or manipulated. Sandra, for her part, was intrigued by Edward in ways that surprised her. She had grown up in a conventional environment where young men were expected to follow predictable paths: college, career, marriage, family, in orderly sequence. Edward represented something entirely different: adventure, spontaneity, and the possibility that life could be filled with experiences that transcended ordinary expectations. Their conversations revealed that Sandra had her own restless spirit, carefully hidden beneath the surface of her conventional engagement and proper social behavior. She asked Edward questions about circus life that revealed a genuine curiosity about alternative ways of living, and she listened to his stories with the kind of fascination that suggested she was hungry for experiences beyond what her planned future with Don Price would provide. But Sandra was also honest about her situation and her obligations. She was engaged to Don Price, and breaking that engagement would create consequences that would affect not just her own life, but also her family's position in the community and their business relationships. She couldn't simply follow her heart without considering the practical impact on people she cared about. Edward understood and respected Sandra's position, but he also believed that true love was worth whatever sacrifices might be required to achieve it. He began to court Sandra with the same patient determination he had shown when fishing for the giant fish, confident in his eventual success, but willing to invest whatever time and effort the goal required. As Edward's relationship with Sandra deepened through their conversations at Auburn, the situation inevitably became more complicated due to Don Price's continued presence in Sandra's life. Don was not merely an obstacle to Edward's romantic ambitions. He was a genuinely decent person who loved Sandra sincerely, and had every reasonable expectation that their engagement would lead to marriage. Don Price represented everything that conventional society valued in a prospective husband. He was financially secure, socially prominent, and completely devoted to Sandra's happiness as he understood it. His family had deep roots in the community, and his business prospects were excellent. From any practical perspective, Sandra's engagement to Don was an ideal situation that promised security, respect, and comfortable prosperity. But Edward could see that Sandra's relationship with Don, while comfortable and secure, lacked the spark of genuine passion and mutual understanding that could sustain a lifetime of marriage. Don loved Sandra, but he loved an idealized version of her that fit his expectations, rather than accepting and celebrating the real woman with all her complexities and contradictions. Edward observed that Don tried to shape Sandra into his vision of the perfect wife, discouraging her from expressing opinions that differed from his own, and dismissing her interests that didn't align with his ideas about appropriate feminine behavior. Don's love was real, but limiting, offering Sandra security in exchange for conformity. The competition between Edward and Don wasn't hostile or dramatic. Don was initially unaware that Edward represented a romantic threat, seeing him simply as an interesting stranger who happened to be part of the circus that was temporarily entertaining the the university community. By the time Don recognized the true nature of Edward's interest in Sandra, the situation had already developed beyond simple rivalry. Edward's approach to winning Sandra's affections was completely different from Don's conventional courtship. Instead of offering security and social status, Edward offered adventure and the promise of a life filled with extraordinary experiences. Instead of trying to shape Sandra into an ideal, Edward encouraged her to explore and express her authentic self without limitations or expectations. The contrast between the two men's approaches became most obvious in their different attitudes towards Sandra's intelligence and independence. Don appreciated Sandra's education, but expected her to set aside her teaching ambitions once they married, focusing instead on supporting his career and managing their household. Edward, on the other hand, was fascinated by Sandra's mind and encouraged her to pursue whatever goals would bring her fulfillment and joy. This fundamental difference in how they saw Sandra's future created a choice that went beyond simple romantic preference. Sandra had to decide between a safe, conventional future that would meet social expectations and the uncertain but potentially extraordinary life that would allow her to become the person she was truly meant to be. The decision was made more difficult by the genuine affection Sandra felt for Don. She had known him since childhood, and he had always been kind, reliable, and devoted to her happiness. Breaking their engagement would hurt him deeply and create social consequences that would affect both their families for years to come. But Sandra's conversations with Edward had awakened possibilities she had never seriously considered before. Through his stories and his perspective on life, she began to imagine herself as someone who could have adventures, make independent choices, and live according to her own values, rather than simply fulfilling other people's expectations. Edward's courtship of Sandra reached its climax through a gesture that was both incredibly romantic and completely impractical. Exactly the kind of grand romantic gesture that separated Edward from more conventional suitors like Don Price. Edward had learned through careful observation that Sandra's favorite flowers were daffodils, which bloomed briefly each spring and created golden carpets across the Alabama countryside. Sandra had mentioned in one of their conversations that daffodils represented hope and renewal to her, and that seeing fields of them in bloom always lifted her spirits and reminded her that winter eventually gives way to beauty. The problem was that Edward's courtship was taking place during the wrong season for daffodils. It was late summer, and the spring flowers had long since faded, leaving no natural source for the gesture Edward wanted to make. For most people, this timing issue would have been an insurmountable obstacle, but Edward saw it simply as a challenge that required creative problem-solving. Edward began researching every possible source of daffodils within traveling distance of Auburn. He contacted florists in multiple states, searched for greenhouse operations that might have daffodils growing out of season, and even explored the possibility of having flowers shipped from distant locations where the growing seasons were different. Eventually, Edward discovered that there was a way to obtain massive quantities of daffodils, but it would require an enormous expenditure of time, money, and effort. He would need to place special orders with growers from multiple states, coordinate complex shipping arrangements, and personally ensure that thousands of flowers arrived in Auburn in perfect condition. The cost of this gesture would consume every dollar Edward had saved from his circus work, plus money he would need to borrow against future earnings. The logistics would require him to work around the clock for several days, managing details that had to be precisely coordinated to achieve the effect he envisioned. But Edward was absolutely certain that winning Sandra's love was worth any sacrifice, and he threw himself into the daffodil project with the same determination he had shown when catching the giant fish or solving Ashton's flooding problem. On the morning when Edward's surprise was ready, Sandra emerged from her dormitory to find the entire university quad covered with daffodils. Thousands of golden flowers had been arranged to create a beautiful, fragrant carpet that transformed the familiar campus into something magical and dreamlike. The effect was breathtaking and completely unprecedented. Students gathering for morning classes stopped in amazement. Faculty members paused to admire the unexpected beauty, and word of the flower display spread rapidly throughout the university community. But the most important reaction was Sandra's. When she saw the daffodil display and realized that Edward had created this extraordinary gesture specifically for her, she understood that she was being offered something that Don Price, despite his devotion, would never be able to provide. A love that was willing to move mountains or cover entire campuses with flowers, simply to bring her joy. In that moment, surrounded by thousands of daffodils that represented hope, renewal, and the possibility of extraordinary love, Sandra made her choice. She ended her engagement to Don Price and accepted Edward's proposal of marriage, choosing adventure and passionate love over security and conventional expectations. The daffodil gesture became legendary at Auburn University and in the surrounding community. But more importantly, it established the pattern that would characterize Edward and Sandra's entire relationship. A love that was expressed through gestures both grand and small, a willingness to go to any lengths for each other's happiness, and a shared belief that life should be filled with beauty and wonder. The wedding of Edward Bloom and Sandra Templeton was celebrated with the kind of joy and community participation that marked truly special occasions in small southern towns. Despite the unconventional circumstances of their courtship and the social disruption caused by Sandra's broken engagement to Don Price, the community ultimately embraced the match and helped create a wedding that reflected both families' values and traditions. Sandra's parents, while initially concerned about their daughter's choice to marry a circus performer rather than a financially secure young man from a prominent family, were won over by Edward's genuine love for Sandra and his obvious commitment to her happiness. They could see that Edward brought out qualities in Sandra that had been suppressed during her engagement to Don: confidence, enthusiasm, and a willingness to embrace life fully, rather than simply accepting what seemed safe and conventional. The wedding took place in the small church where Sandra had taught Sunday school, with decorations that included daffodils specially ordered to honor the gesture that had sealed their engagement. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional, but the celebration that followed was filled with the kind of music, storytelling, and community fellowship that Edward had experienced during his circus travels. Members of Callaway's circus attended the wedding and contributed entertainment that made the reception unlike anything the local community had ever experienced. Carl the Giant served as Edward's best man, and his gentle, imposing presence added dignity and uniqueness to the ceremony. Amos Callaway, despite his typically nocturnal nature, made a special effort to attend and offer his blessing to the couple. The wedding guests included people from every phase of Edward's life: childhood friends from Ashton, who remembered the boy who caught the giant fish, fellow circus performers who had come to respect Edward's work ethic and natural leadership abilities, and new friends from Sandra's world who were curious about the young man who had won her heart with such dramatic, romantic gestures. But the most meaningful aspect of the wedding was the obvious happiness and compatibility between Edward and Sandra themselves. They moved through the celebration with the kind of natural grace and mutual support that suggested they were genuinely meant to be partners in all of life's adventures. Sandra had made her choice with full understanding of what she was accepting and what she was leaving behind. She knew that marriage to Edward would mean a life of uncertainty and adventure rather than predictable security. But she also knew that it would mean being loved completely for who she truly was, rather than who someone else wanted her to become. Edward, for his part, understood that winning Sandra's love was just the beginning of his responsibility to her. He was committing himself not just to romantic devotion, but to building a life together that would honor Sandra's intelligence, independence, and dreams, while also providing the stability and security that any marriage required to survive and thrive. The wedding celebration continued late into the evening, with music, dancing, and storytelling that brought together people from different backgrounds and perspectives in shared appreciation for love, commitment, and the possibility of happiness. When Edward and Sandra finally departed for their honeymoon, they left behind a community that had been enriched by witnessing their courtship and wedding. The early years of Edward and Sandra's marriage were filled with the kind of happiness and adventure they had both hoped for when they chose each other over more conventional alternatives. Edward left the circus to focus on building a stable life with Sandra, but he found ways to maintain the spirit of adventure and discovery that had always characterized his approach to life. But their peaceful domestic happiness was interrupted by larger events beyond their control. The Korean War created military obligations that Edward could not avoid, and like many young men of his generation, he found himself drafted into service that would take him far from home and the wife he adored. Edward's departure for military service was painful for both him and Sandra, but they approached the separation with the same confidence and determination that had carried them through their courtship. Edward was certain that he would return home safely. The witch's glass eye had shown him dying peacefully as an old man, surrounded by family, and Sandra trusted in both that prophecy and her husband's resourcefulness and luck. The war itself was unlike anything Edward had previously experienced. Military service required different qualities than circus life or small-town adventure. Discipline, following orders, and working within systems that he couldn't change or influence through charm and creativity. But Edward adapted to military life with characteristic enthusiasm, finding ways to contribute meaningfully while maintaining the optimistic perspective that had always sustained him. Edward's war stories, as he later told them to Will and others, focused on the human connections he made, rather than on combat or violence. He described meeting fellow soldiers from different backgrounds and regions, learning about their families and dreams, while sharing stories about Sandra and his own adventures in civilian life. One of the most significant relationships Edward formed during his military service was with a pair of conjoined twins named Ping and Jing, who had somehow ended up serving in the same unit, despite the obvious challenges their condition would create for military service. Edward never explained exactly how this unusual situation had come about, but his stories suggested that the twins had found ways to contribute to the war effort that took advantage of their unique perspective and abilities. Edward's friendship with Ping and Jing became one of his favorite war stories, involving adventures that were both dangerous and absurd, requiring creative problem-solving and the kind of teamwork that could only develop between people who completely trusted each other. The twins taught Edward lessons about cooperation, adaptation, and finding humor in even the most difficult circumstances. But the most important aspect of Edward's military service was how it deepened his appreciation for the life he had built with Sandra. Being separated from her for months at a time made him realize how central she had become to his sense of identity and purpose. The letters they exchanged during his deployment and became treasured documents that sustained them both through the loneliness and uncertainty of wartime separation. Edward's war service also gave him stories and experiences that would enrich his storytelling for the rest of his life. He returned home with a broader perspective on the world and a deeper appreciation for the everyday miracles of peaceful domestic life with someone you love completely. Among all of Edward's war stories, none captured his listener's imagination, quite like his tales of Ping and Jing, the conjoined twins who became his closest companions during his military service in Korea. Edward described them as remarkable individuals who had learned to turn what many people would consider a disadvantage into a source of unique strengths and abilities. According to Edward's accounts, Ping and Jing were joined at the side, but had developed such perfect coordination and communication that they moved together with a grace and efficiency that surpassed what either could have achieved separately. They had learned to anticipate each other's thoughts and movements so completely that they functioned almost like a single person with enhanced capabilities. The twins had somehow convinced military recruiters to accept them for service, despite their obvious physical challenges, though Edward never explained exactly how this had been accomplished. His stories suggested that Ping and Jing had skills that made them valuable to military operations in ways that their unusual condition actually enhanced rather than hindered. Edward described adventures with the twins that combined danger, humor, and the kind of creative problem-solving that characterized all of his favorite stories. In one tale, their ability to face in two directions simultaneously allowed them to serve as exceptionally effective sentries, able to monitor approaches from multiple angles without any blind spots or moments of inattention. In another story, their perfect coordination allowed them to accomplish tasks that would normally require multiple people, such as complex equipment repairs that needed simultaneous work at different locations. Their shared consciousness meant they could communicate and coordinate without speaking, making them ideal partners for situations that required stealth and silence. But beyond their practical contributions to military operations, Ping and Jing served as Edward's introduction to a different way of thinking about individual identity and personal relationships. Watching them navigate the world as two people who were also one person taught Edward lessons about cooperation, compromise, and the ways that true partnership could create possibilities that neither person could achieve alone. The twins' relationship with each other became a model for Edward's understanding of his own marriage to Sandra. Like Ping and Jing, Edward and Sandra had learned to function as partners whose different strengths complemented each other perfectly, creating a combined capability that exceeded what either could accomplish independently. Edward's friendship with the twins also reinforced his belief that the most extraordinary people were often those who had learned to transform apparent disadvantages into unique strengths. Ping and Jing had never been able to live conventional lives, but this limitation had forced them to develop exceptional qualities of character, creativity, and mutual support that made them remarkable individuals. When Edward's military service ended and he returned to Alabama, he found himself welcomed, not just as a beloved husband returning to his wife, but as a local hero whose war stories had already begun to spread through the community. Sandra had shared some of Edward's letters during his absence, and people were fascinated by his accounts of adventure and friendship in distant places. The homecoming was everything Edward had hoped for during his months of military service. Sandra met him at the train station, and their reunion was filled with the joy of two people who had missed each other terribly, but had never doubted that they would be together again. The separation had strengthened rather than weakened their relationship, proving that their love could survive challenges and distance. Edward's return also marked the beginning of a new phase in his relationship with his community. His military service had given him experiences and perspectives that set him apart from men who had remained in Alabama throughout the war, and people were eager to hear his stories and learn from his adventures. But Edward was also eager to settle back into domestic life with Sandra and to focus on building the kind of future they had planned together before the war interrupted their early married years. Military service had been an important experience, but it was not the life Edward wanted to live permanently. He was ready to return to the pursuit of adventures that he could share with Sandra, rather than experiences that took him away from her. The challenge was finding ways to satisfy Edward's need for adventure and challenge within the context of a peaceful domestic life in post-war Alabama. Edward was not content to simply settle into a conventional job and routine lifestyle, but he also didn't want to pursue adventures that would require lengthy separations from Sandra. The solution came through Edward's growing reputation as a storyteller and his natural talents for leadership and community building. People throughout the region had heard about the young man who had caught the giant fish, solved Ashton's flooding problem, won his wife with thousands of daffodils, and returned from the war with amazing stories about conjoined twin companions. This reputation created opportunities for Edward to become involved in community development projects that would allow him to use his creativity and problem-solving abilities while remaining close to home and Sandra. Local governments and business groups began consulting with Edward problems and looked to him for leadership during community challenges. Years after his first visit to the magical town of Spectre with his friend Carl the Giant, Edward learned that the perfect community had fallen on difficult times and needed the kind of help that he was uniquely qualified to provide. The town that had once represented peace and timeless contentment was struggling with problems that threatened its very existence. Edward discovered that Spectre's difficulties had begun gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The town's magical qualities had always depended on a delicate balance between the residents' contentment and their connection to the outside world. But as the years passed and the modern world changed around them, Spectre had become increasingly isolated and forgotten, cut off from the resources and relationships that even magical places need to survive. The roads that led to Spectre had become overgrown and impassable, making it nearly impossible for visitors to find the town or for residents to maintain connections with the outside world. The town's infrastructure, its buildings, bridges, and public spaces, had begun to deteriorate without access to modern materials and expertise. Most seriously, the young people of Spectre had begun to leave, seeking opportunities and experiences that the isolated town could no longer provide. When Edward learned about Spectre's troubles, he felt a deep sense of responsibility to help the community that had once welcomed him so graciously. Even though he had chosen to leave Spectre in favor of adventure and uncertainty, he remembered the kindness and wisdom of its residents, and he understood that their way of life deserved to be preserved and protected. But helping Spectre would require more than just goodwill and individual effort. The town needed significant financial investment, practical expertise, and connections to the outside world that could provide ongoing support for its restoration and development. Edward realized that this project would require him to leverage all of his experience, relationships, and resources, unique character, while making it viable for the future. The restoration project became one of Edward's most ambitious undertakings, requiring him to coordinate resources from multiple sources and manage complex logistics over an extended period. He had to rebuild roads, restore buildings, update infrastructure, and create new economic opportunities that would attract young people back to Spectre while maintaining the peaceful atmosphere that made the town special. But the most important aspect of Edward's work in Spectre was his ability to help the community adapt to changing times without losing its essential character. He understood that Spectre's magic came from its residents' commitment to peace, cooperation, and mutual support, and he found ways to preserve those values while making the practical changes necessary for the town's survival. Edward's investment in Spectre represented a new phase in his approach to adventure and achievement. Instead of seeking individual experiences and personal glory, he was using his talents and resources to benefit an entire community, creating something lasting and meaningful that would continue to enrich people's lives long after he was gone. Edward's commitment to saving Spectre eventually required him to make a financial investment so large that it essentially meant purchasing the entire town and taking responsibility for its future development and management. This decision represented both the culmination of Edward's success as a businessman and his willingness to risk everything for causes he believed in. By this point in his life, Edward had built a successful career as a traveling salesman, using his natural charm and storytelling. Sandra supported Edward's decision to purchase Spectre, understanding that this investment reflected her husband's deepest values and his commitment to using his success to benefit others rather than simply accumulating wealth for its own sake. But ownership also created enormous responsibilities and pressures. Edward became accountable for the well-being of everyone who lived in Spectre, and he had to balance the competing needs and interests of different residents while maintaining the town's unique character and atmosphere. The decision to purchase Spectre represented Edward's evolution from an adventurer who sought personal experiences to a leader who used his talents and resources to create opportunities for others. It was a demonstration of his belief that individual success was meaningful only when it contributed to the well-being of communities and the people he cared about. The relationships Edward built through his sales career became one of his most valuable assets, creating a network of friends and contacts throughout the region who could provide information, assistance, and opportunities for future business ventures. These connections would later prove essential when Edward needed support for projects like the restoration of Spectre. But Edward's sales career was also important to his personal development and his understanding of human nature. Traveling throughout the South during the post-war years gave him first-hand exposure to the social and economic changes that were transforming American society, and he learned to adapt his approach to different communities and cultural contexts. Edward's work required him to be away from home for days or weeks at a time, which created both challenges and benefits for his marriage to Sandra. The separations were difficult, but they also made their reunions more precious and... During his years as a traveling salesman, Edward collected many unusual encounters that later became part of his storytelling repertoire, including his meetings with the reclusive poet and a gentleman bank robber who crossed his path during different phases of his career. The poet, according to Edward's version of events, lived alone in a cabin deep in the woods of rural Alabama, surviving on wild plants and the occasional kindness of strangers who brought supplies. Edward claimed to have discovered the man's hiding place during a particularly difficult sales trip when his car broke down on a remote country road. Edward described the poet as a brilliant but troubled man who had once been famous in literary circles but had retreated from society after a series of personal disappointments and professional setbacks. The poet had been living as a hermit for many years, writing verse that no one would ever read and talking only to the forest animals. In Edward's telling, he spent 3 days with the poet while waiting for his car to be repaired, during which time they shared philosophical conversations about life, art, and the nature of truth and storytelling. The poet supposedly taught Edward important lessons about the power of imagination and the difference between literal truth and emotional truth. The bank robber story took place several years later when Edward was driving through a small town in Mississippi and stopped for lunch at a local diner. According to Edward, the robber was a well-dressed, polite gentleman who had been conducting a series of robberies throughout the South, but who never used violence or took more money than he needed for basic survival. Edward claimed that he recognized the man from wanted posters and newspaper descriptions, but instead of turning him in, he engaged him in conversation and learned about the circumstances that had led him to a life of crime. The robber had supposedly lost his family farm during the Depression and turned to robbery as a way of getting revenge against the banks that had foreclosed on honest farmers. In Edward's version of events, he convinced the robber to give up his criminal career and helped him find legitimate work with one of Edward's business contacts in another state. The man supposedly went on to become a successful farmer and respected member of his new community, though he maintained contact with Edward over the years. These stories, like many of Edward's tales, contained elements that seemed plausible, alongside details that stretched the boundaries of believability. Will and others who heard them were never quite sure which parts might be based on real experiences and which parts were products of Edward's imagination and storytelling instincts. The stories served Edward's purposes as entertainment and as vehicles for communicating his values and beliefs about human nature, redemption, and the power of understanding and compassion to transform difficult situations. But they also contributed to Will's growing frustration with his inability to separate fact from fiction in his father's accounts of his own life. When Edward finally collapsed during what should have been a simple trip to the grocery store, Sandra called an ambulance and rode with him to the hospital, holding his hand and trying to reassure him that everything would be all right. The doctors ran tests and discovered that Edward was suffering from cancer that had already spread throughout his body. The diagnosis was devastating for Sandra, but Edward seemed almost unsurprised by the news, as if he had been expecting this development for some time. He told Sandra and the medical staff that he had always known how his story would end, referring to his childhood visit to the witch who had shown him his death in her glass eye. Will contacted some of Edward's old business associates and friends from his traveling salesman days, and was amazed to learn that many of Edward's seemingly impossible accomplishments were actually based on real events, though often simplified or dramatized in the retelling. The giant fish story, for example, was confirmed by several witnesses who remembered Edward's legendary fishing success during a company outing years earlier. Through his research, Will discovered that Edward had indeed been a local hero in several communities throughout Alabama and neighboring states, known for his generosity, his problem-solving abilities, and his talent for bringing people together around common projects and goals. The restoration of Spectre, which Will had assumed was pure fantasy, turned out to be based on Edward's real involvement in revitalizing several small towns during economic downturns. Will learned that his father had quietly helped many families through financial difficulties over the years, often providing assistance in ways that allowed people to maintain their dignity and self-respect. Edward had used his business connections and his understanding of human nature to create opportunities for people who were struggling, but he had never talked about these activities in straightforward terms. The poet and bank robber stories, while probably embellished, appeared to be based on real encounters Edward had experienced during his travels, though the actual details were likely less dramatic and more mundane than the versions Will had heard repeatedly throughout his childhood. Edward had indeed met many unusual and interesting people during his career, and had maintained correspondence with some of them for decades. Will also discovered that Edward had been more successful in his business ventures than he had ever indicated to his family, and that he had quietly invested his earnings in ways that had provided security for Sandra and had contributed to various community development projects throughout the region. Edward's apparent carelessness about money had actually masked a sophisticated understanding of finance and investment. Most significantly, Will learned that Edward had spent considerable time and effort documenting his real experiences and achievements, keeping detailed records and photographs that he had never shared with his family. These materials revealed the factual foundation underlying many of his most fantastic stories, showing how Edward had transformed ordinary but meaningful experiences into larger-than-life narratives. The discovery of this hidden documentation helped Will understand that his father's storytelling was not an attempt to deceive or avoid reality, but rather a creative process through which Edward had tried to share the wonder and significance he had found in his actual experiences. The stories were Edward's way of celebrating life and inspiring others to see the extraordinary potential in ordinary circumstances. During a quiet moment when Edward was awake, but very weak, Will asked his father how he wanted his story to end. Edward smiled and admitted that while he had always known he would die by the river, as the witch had shown him years earlier, he had never been able to imagine the specific circumstances or details of that final scene. Will realized that this was his opportunity to step into his father's role as storyteller and to create a narrative that would give Edward the kind of meaningful and magical conclusion he had always provided for the characters in his own tales. For the first time, Will would use his imagination to create something beautiful, rather than using his analytical skills to verify facts. Will began telling Edward a story about his final day, describing how Will would help his father escape from the hospital and drive him down to the river, where Edward had caught his legendary fish and had experienced so many important moments throughout his life. In Will's story, they would be joined at the river by all the characters from Edward's various adventures over the years. As Will continued the story, he described how Carl the Giant would be there, along with the conjoined twins Ping and Jing, Amos Calloway from the circus, the poet from the woods, and all the other colorful personalities who had populated Edward's tales. Even Don Price, Edward's old rival for Sandra's affections, would be there to pay his respects and acknowledge Edward's superior storytelling abilities. In Will's version, Edward would walk into the river, surrounded by all these friends and companions, and as he entered the water, he would transform into the giant fish that had always been his alter ego and his symbol of freedom and adventure. As the great fish, Edward would swim away into the depths of the river, finally free from the constraints of his aging body and ready for whatever new adventures awaited him. Edward listened to Will's story with tears in his eyes, clearly moved by his son's willingness to embrace the storytelling tradition that had defined Edward's approach to life and communication. For Edward, Will's story represented not just a beautiful ending to his own narrative, but also a sign that his son had finally understood and accepted the value of imagination and wonder. The story served as a bridge between Edward's fantastical approach to life and Will's more practical nature, showing how both perspectives could coexist and complement each other. Will had learned to appreciate the emotional truth and inspirational power of his father's stories while maintaining his own commitment to accuracy and reality in appropriate contexts. Edward died peacefully shortly after Will finished telling the story, with Sandra and Will holding his hands and expressing their love and gratitude for all the joy and wonder he had brought into their lives through his stories and his generous spirit. The planning of Edward's funeral became an opportunity for Will and Sandra to celebrate Edward's life and to bring together all the people whose lives had been touched by his stories and his genuine kindness and generosity over the decades of his adventures and business activities. Sandra had maintained Edward's address books and correspondence files throughout their marriage, and Will was amazed to discover how many people had remained in contact with his father over the years. The network of friends and acquaintances Edward had built through his travels and business dealings stretched across multiple states and included people from every walk of life. As word of Edward's death spread through the various communities where he had lived and worked, people began calling Sandra to express their condolences and to share their own memories of Edward's impact on their lives. Many of these callers were people Will had never heard of, but whose stories revealed new aspects of his father's character and achievements. The funeral service itself was held at the local church where Edward and Sandra had been married decades earlier, but the building was not nearly large enough to accommodate all the people who wanted to attend. The overflow crowd gathered outside, sharing stories and memories while listening to the service through speakers that the funeral director had hastily arranged. Will served as one of the eulogists, choosing to honor his father by telling the river story he had created during Edward's final days. The congregation listened with rapt attention as Will described the magical scene of Edward's transformation into the great fish, and many people were visibly moved by the beauty and appropriateness of the image. But the most surprising and moving part of the funeral came during the procession to the cemetery, when Will and Sandra saw the remarkable gathering of people who had come to pay their respects to Edward. As they followed the hearse through the streets of their town, Will began recognizing faces from his father's stories, people who had seemed like fictional characters, but who turned out to be real individuals whose lives had intersected with Edward's in meaningful ways. Carl the Giant was there, older now, but still towering above the crowd, walking slowly alongside other circus performers who had worked with Edward during his brief career as Amos Calloway's assistant. The conjoined twins Ping and Jing had traveled from their current home in California to attend the funeral, bringing with them photographs and letters that documented their long friendship with Edward. Don Price was there too, now a successful businessman, but still recognizable as the young man who had competed with Edward for Sandra's affections at Auburn University. He approached Sandra after the service to express his condolences and to acknowledge that Edward had indeed been the better man and the superior storyteller of the two rivals. Even more remarkably, Will spotted several people whose appearances matched Edward's descriptions of characters from his more unusual adventures, including a man who could have been the reformed bank robber and a woman who might have been the witch from the swamp, though Will never confirmed these identifications and was content to let them remain mysteries. The gathering at the As Will left the cemetery that day, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for his father's legacy and a new appreciation for the power of storytelling to preserve and share the things that matter most in human life. He also felt a responsibility to continue Edward's tradition in his own way, finding methods to celebrate and honor the people and experiences that would shape his own son's understanding of family, community, and the possibilities for wonder and adventure in everyday life. The movie ends with Will beginning to tell his own son some of the stories about his grandfather, but now with a deeper understanding of their purpose and meaning. Will realizes that the stories are not just entertainment, but a way of passing on values, maintaining connections, and celebrating the extraordinary potential that exists within ordinary human experiences. Through his journey of understanding his father's stories, Will has learned that truth can take many forms, and that the emotional and spiritual truths conveyed through narrative can be just as important and valid as the factual truths he values in his professional life. The reconciliation between father and son is complete, achieved not through literal understanding, but through Will's acceptance and appreciation of Edward's different but equally meaningful approach to sharing life's experiences and lessons. The end. If you are still awake, try our other movie story videos. Subscribe if you liked the video. Thanks.